actually hasn't, and so I can base this on a lot of rigorous evidence. So one of my own studies looked at the performance of companies over 28 years that treated their workers well. And importantly, those 28 years includes booms and recessions, and it found that the outperformance was just as strong in the recessions. And indeed, a study by one of my colleagues looked at ESG performance on all dimensions, not just employees, and actually found that that was more important in recessions. Why? Because that's when customer trust is particularly important. So it's not just a luxury good, it's fundamental to the success of a business. So I think firms should shift their thinking on what ESG actually means. So we typically think about a business creating value which is depicted by a pie, and a responsible business gives a lot of that pie to stakeholders and not to shareholders. But that's really tricky in the crisis. Why? Because the pie has shrunk. There are companies that just can't afford to pay their workers. Not everybody is in a related industry like Unilever and can give 100 million euros of food and sanitizer. So instead, what responsibility means at this time is about growing the pie through innovation. So even if you don't have loads of cash in your balance sheet, it's not about donating, but being innovative. So you might think, well, what does it mean to be innovative? I think every business leader should ask herself, what is in my hand? What are the resources that I am entrusted with, and how can I use them to serve wider society? And I think the power of this is that it can apply to every company, even companies in unrelated industries. So let's take Chelsea Football Club. You might think, well, what does a football team have which is useful in the crisis? But what is in their hand is a hotel, and they're allowing NHS workers to stay at that hotel. Or you might be LVMH, which is a perfume manufacturer. You might think, well, why is that useful in the crisis? Well, what is in their hand is a factory which is able to make alcohol, and they can use that alcohol not for perfumes, but instead for sanitizer. So I think we can think very innovatively about how can we use the resources that we're entrusted with and redeploy them to serve wider society in this crisis. First, we should think about what the objective of government policy should be. So I remember when I was young and I used to play these Monopoly games, and sometimes it was bedtime, so we couldn't continue the game. But what we had to ensure was that the board was frozen overnight, and so we could play the next day from that same board. And I think that's what government policy should be like, is it should try to freeze what the economy looked like before the crisis. And so that if that involves giving a lot of liquidity to small businesses to allow them to survive, I think that's critically important, because if small businesses go under, not only are the people who are workers and owners of those businesses affected, but also competition is affected, and we're going to lose a lot of these small competitors. I think the second thing that multinationals can do is to encourage a lot of collaboration. So we've seen that in the past. So in the Second World War, we had not enough penicillin to help the Allied forces. And so we had some former competitors like Merck and Squibb get together in order to try to make penicillin together. And I think a lot of coordination between potential rivals can help out. Apple and Google, for example, developing contact tracing systems. Crisis is indeed absolutely devastating. I think a small silver lining is if we pivot what it means to be responsible from just donating parts of the pie to being innovative, I think this would be really beneficial. And I think that will be spurred by the crisis, because there are companies that can't give products because they're not in the related industry. So what they need to do is to think innovatively. And if we indeed see these pivots, for example, perfume manufacturers making sanitizer, then maybe going forwards, the resource usage on the economy is going to go down because we're able to redeploy a certain amount of resources for many, many purposes.